Right now on Close Up, less than a month until the Iowa caucuses, the big surprises, the predictions, and who needs to win. KCCI 8 News Close Up starts right now.
This is Iowa's news leader. This is KCCI 8 News Close Up.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us on KCCI 8 News Close Up. I'm Stacy Horst. Caucus night is less than a month away, and a whole lot can happen between now and then. Joining me this morning to talk about that is Tom Henderson with the Polk County Democrats and Republican political consultant Eric Wolfson. Thank you both for being with us this morning. So tell us, what needs to happen, Tom, between now and caucus night?
Well, this last 30 days are going to be really exciting because this is the time when the candidates are going to reach out one more time to the voters, get them to commit to going to caucus night, which is an investment. A lot of people have never done it before. I've been contacted by literally hundreds of people who want to know how to do it, how to get registered. So the interesting thing on caucus night is to see whether all these supporters will turn up, especially when it comes to, I think, the Sanders and Trump campaigns.
And Eric, we'll be seeing probably a lot more campaign ads, a lot more in-state, in-person visits from the candidates, too?
Absolutely. A lot more candidate days in the state. And I think Tom makes a great point about the candidates making that contact with voters. And, you know, there's an old saying, you see who's swimming naked when the tide goes out. And the tide goes out on caucus night. And in terms of organization, we're going to start to figure out who really has the organization on the ground, who's able to turn the people out, and who maybe thought had a good organization and really doesn't.
Because organization really is the key here, because this isn't just a matter of going to the voting booth and casting a ballot. You're there for a couple of hours at least, right?
That's correct. You make a little bit of investment in time. It's a good investment, and people who have gone through the caucus process really enjoy it once they've done it, but it is an investment of time. You may have to get a sitter. You may have to make arrangements in your schedule to be there. So it is a commitment.
Well, Eric, who needs to win? It's a crowded GOP field still, surprisingly so. Who needs to win?
Well, you know, normally I would say Senator Cruz needs to win. He's perceived as the front runner right now. But it's an interesting year. He has a tremendous amount of resources that would enable him to go on and to be strong in states down the road. I think Donald Trump, we're going to see if he doesn't win what his psyche is, and that's going to be important. But I think, you know, somebody like Governor Bush is going to have a strong showing, or else the cracks that are already there are going to continue to widen.
How many tickets out of Iowa?
I think 3. You know, early on with so many candidates in the race, I was thinking it might be 4, might be 5. But as we've seen this race kind of consolidated, a Cruz-Trump race, and I think probably in the next 2 weeks we're going to see a third-place candidate maybe come to the fore. I think we're going to see a wide chasm between the top 2, top 3, and those single-digit folks down at the bottom.
And Tom, what about the Democratic side? Who needs to win the Democratic caucus?
Well, I think it'll be big news if either Clinton or Trump don't win. I think that would be a big news story the next day. So I would guess both those campaigns would really want to win here. For the Democrats, we only have 3 candidates, and I think that they all 3 survived in New Hampshire. But I think the story will be how well they do here in Iowa, and that'll be another thing they'll look at.
Does a Clinton win here seal the deal and kind of put to an end the primary race for the Democrats?
No, because right now in New Hampshire, Sanders is leading. So I think this will continue for some time, at least down to Super Tuesday. So I think you'll see candidates in the race. O'Malley's making a nice run now. He's actually come up to double digits in the polling. So you may see him become more of a formidable candidate, too. So we'll just see what happens with time.
Now, you said Sanders is leading in New Hampshire, which has kind of been considered Clinton country. Right. Why Sanders leading?
I think because he's from the Northeast. I mean, it's a state that's just a neighboring state. And I think the New Hampshire folks really like that, having somebody from Vermont in the race. They feel comfortable with him. And that might be one of the reasons he's leading. I assume he's got a good organization there, and he spent time there, too, that might have an impact on the number as well.
Now, Eric, I want to ask you a cross-party question here. Democrats are really hoping that Hillary Clinton would have a tough primary challenge in order to kind of solidify her going into the general. Has she had a tough enough challenge?
I think she's had a good challenge. I think having Bernie Sanders in the race has benefited. It's helped her. It's caused her at times to say some things maybe that she shouldn't say that may help us in the general election. But I think by and large it's given her an opportunity to be a centrist, to move more to the center, and to, of course, build that organization that she needs to build, and to go through all the things that a candidate needs to do to kind of toughen them up.
Of course, there is an anti-establishment sentiment here in the country from both parties. I think we're hearing a lot of that. Does an establishment candidate have a chance, Tom?
Oh, I think they always have a chance. We've seen other situations before where a candidate's come on who's supposedly non-establishment, make a nice run and not actually get the nomination. So I still think that the powers are kind of laid there for them to get the nomination. You look at the DNC right now and some of the controversy that's swirling around Sanders, access to data. It indicates to me that the Clinton people really do have control of the DNC in a lot of respects. So that's a pretty good handle, the fact that establishment candidates usually do have a good leg up.
And I think on the Republican side, the establishment is going to have to start to make some decisions, probably after South Carolina. If Cruz wins in Iowa or Trump wins in Iowa, I think Mr. Trump does win in New Hampshire. South Carolina, they've got to decide, do we coalesce around Ted Cruz in order to edge out Mr. Trump, or do we go with Senator Rubio? But I think the establishment, has a lot of staying power, and they're going to have a big voice in this race farther down the road.
But it is interesting how the establishment has not coalesced around one candidate. And right now there are about 5 or 6 candidates splitting 25% of the vote. That's surprising for the Republican Party, isn't it?
It's having such a large field, I think, really jumbled things up early on. The question of what kind of influence super PACs we're going to have jumbled up the race in a big respect, too. And then I think just this emergence of the anti-establishment folks. We expected early on, I think after 8 years of President Obama, in the sense that, okay, there was a freshman senator that was elected president, Republicans are going to emphasize experience. Well, experience really isn't what voters seem to want this cycle.
And it is every election season. It also seems that there's a call to end Iowa's first in the nation status, with criticisms that we have a small population that is not diverse. Could a matter of who wins the caucus put that first in the nation status in jeopardy?
It's not a matter of who wins it, who might lose it and then become president and may decide to do away with the first in the nation status. The Iowa caucuses are a wonderful place because candidates who don't have a lot of money can come here. They can meet voters face-to-face. Voters get to meet a potential president face-to-face. And it's a great system. It's a great time for the United States to have an opportunity to meet, I think, a president on a local level and get that type of experience from what the Iowa voters gain from that experience. I hope that they don't do away with it. The fact that we're not diverse did not make any difference in 2008 when Obama won the Iowa caucuses. We don't have a very large African-American population, but I think we tend to be a state that doesn't have a lot of prejudice.
But if a Tea Party candidate wins out of Iowa, Eric?
Well, again, I'd echo exactly what Tom said on the Republican side, that we've always been good about working together to protect the caucuses, defend the caucuses. But again, you have, whether it's establishment candidate or not, the caucuses are a tremendous place for people to meet candidates face-to-face. And Iowans take that responsibility very seriously. And I think the national folks do appreciate that, it's not our job necessarily to select a candidate. It's our job to start to win on the field.
Okay. Gentlemen, we'll leave it there. We'll take a quick break. We'll continue our conversation next. And welcome back to KCCI 8 News Close-Up. Joining me this morning, Tom Henderson and Eric Wilson. Now, Donald Trump is a top pick for a number of Republicans, but a lot of people, a lot of political analysts especially, thought his campaign would have fizzled up by now. Should the GOP be worried that it hasn't, and not only has he not gone away, he's grown in popularity?
I mean, I think clearly he's tapped into some sort of voter sentiment. The question is, where do we go from here? I mean, I don't know if we should be worried or not. If I'm Hillary Clinton, maybe I'm worried. If I'm some of the other Republican candidates, I'm probably worried. But I mean, I think we've misread his campaign from the start, how long he was going to stay in, what was going to finish him off. And so, I mean, I've had the most difficult time of making predictions about Donald Trump over the past 5 months, and I'm not sure where we go from here, honestly.
Well, Tom, as a Democrat, from your side of the fence, should the GOP be worried that Donald Trump could become the standard bearer of the party?
I think they should be, because I think he might actually not be a very good candidate for them in the general election because of his positions. He continues to take more and more strident positions to get headlines, and that's not going to serve him well when he has to start appealing to independents and hopefully, you know, a segment of the Democratic Party may want to pick up in the election too. So I never want to wish for any particular candidate to be the nominee, because, you know, I think they need to pick the candidate. But right now, I think a lot of Democrats think that Hillary Clinton would do very well against Donald Trump.
Well, let's talk about his strategy a little bit, Eric. He's known for attacking his rivals. He's now starting to bring up things from the 1990s that the Clintons have dealt with. Yeah. What does that do for him? Does that help him? Does that hurt Clinton?
You know, again, I don't know the long term. I know Tom's comfortable with making that prediction. I don't know long term how that affects this race. There's clearly a lot of people who have been drawn to him, who are you know, have that appeal to support him. I don't know where we go. I honestly don't.
Well, what do you think, Tom? Does Donald Trump bringing up the 1990s stuff, baggage that the Clintons had, does that hurt her?
No, I don't think that will hurt her. And I think we actually have two other nominees, both Sanders and O'Malley, who would do well against Trump as well. The thing about Trump, though, moving forward is that if he doesn't get the nomination, then the question becomes, does he run as an independent? And he has taken that promise off the table now and said that if the RNC doesn't treat him properly, that he will run as an independent. He's got, if you just look at the three candidates who don't have political experience that all seem to be swimming in that kind of early primary in the Republican Party for dominance in that area, you have almost 40% of the vote. That's a pretty significant part of their registered base. So I don't think this is a good thing going forward either way. He either becomes the nominee and may be too strident, or second of all, he may be a really serious independent candidate who could take down the entire ticket.
And I don't see him as an independent candidate. I do think he keeps his word in that respect. You know, again, as I say, he's surprised us so many times. He may surprise us by finding ways to mobilize those people that are supporting him now, and it kind of creates more of a big tent effect for our party. We'll have to wait and see.
Okay, now as we've got a few moments left before we wrap up our segment, what are your thoughts on the Republican field as it stands right now?
I think as it stands right now, Senator Cruz is looking awfully strong. Obviously, Donald Trump is looking strong. We'll see where he goes. Somebody from the establishment lane is going to emerge, whether that's Governor Bush, Governor Christie, Senator Rubio. Not sure at this point, but I think in the end it's going to be an awfully long race to the convention. I don't think we'll settle this thing early.
And Tom, your thoughts on the Democratic field?
Yeah, I think that the next 30 days bear watching, because we saw, for instance, Edwards and Kerry in 2004 make a great run the last 30 days, and we saw Santorum do it in 2012. So I think I would expect things to change, and I don't think that necessarily Cruz is going to be the one who's going to come up on top. I think he could rotate down to third or fourth. We'll see.
Change because people are now starting to really pay attention in the last days.
Exactly. And the attack ads will increase, and the candidates' crossfire will increase, and things will happen.
All right, Tom and Eric, thank you so much for joining us. Our conversation continues up next. KCCI political analyst Dennis Goldford. Stay with us. Welcome back to KCCI 8 News Close-Up. Joining me now is KCCI political analyst Dennis Goldford. Thank you so much for coming in, Dennis. We're a month away from the caucus. What are we going to start to see?
What we're finishing now, or what we've just finished in 2015, is the end of the regular season. Now we're entering the playoffs in this last month. It really counts now. I would normally say that we'll see a lot more of all of these people, but I've been wondering for about a half a year or so whether the traditional two fights in Iowa have split. In other words, Iowa's had a fight over who, on the Republican side, who would become the establishment candidate and who would become the more populist candidate, the social religious conservative. George W. Bush, for example, straddled both of those in 2000. Mike Huckabee and Rick Santorum were the more populist side in 2008 and 2012. But we've seen people like Kasich and Christie and to some extent Bush and to some extent Rubio, though he's been here more recently. They spent more time in New Hampshire. So it's led me to wonder whether Iowa really will be more about a fight for the title of the chief populist candidate as opposed to the chief establishment candidate.
Well, we're seeing some of those candidates spend less time here. Who needs to win here?
Well, remember, the caucuses are all about expectations.
Okay.
Did you do as well as expected? Did you do not as well as expected?
Okay.
And right now, expectations are up for Ted Cruz. So I think he needs to do well here. I think at this point he really does need to do first or almost a tie with Trump if Trump continues along that way. Cruz has a firewall of sorts among southern states. Everything moves south after New Hampshire, and he's paying a lot of attention to them, has been for some time. But I think Cruz needs to win here. I think the question for Rubio, of course, is there a state in which he can win? Because he's everybody's second choice on the Republican side, but nobody's first. On the Democratic side, particularly with memories of 2008, Hillary Clinton has to win.
Okay.
She's got the organizational strength this time. If she doesn't win in Iowa, she's a damaged candidate. I mean, she has her baggage and her flaws anyway. Well known, a solid proportion of the American public, Republicans, of course, and some independents dislike her. So she's got a tough fight in her hands. It's not to say she can't do it, but if she comes out of here with a loss, she comes out of here bleeding. So I think she has to win Iowa. That doesn't mean Sanders can take her in the South, but she really starts to bleed if she doesn't win here.
Okay. Just because she meets expectations doesn't mean she'll see a bump going into New Hampshire, but she won't.
That's right.
You know,
Sanders is currently leading, at least our last data, in New Hampshire. Right. If she were to win here and, of course, beat him there, then really it is on its way for her. But if she should win here and lose there, she still has some support as they move south, particularly among African Americans.
Okay, let's talk about Donald Trump.
I've heard of him.
You know, he has blown away the expectations of everybody who knows about politics and who studied it for a while. I'm sure you are among them. Do the Republicans need to be worried about him?
I think so, because Trump has arisen to a great extent because Republicans, intentionally or not, have misled their base for quite some time. They kept promising their base that if you give us control of the House, we can basically eliminate Obamacare and do all those things they dislike about the Obama administration. If you give us control of the Senate, which they won last time around, and the House, we can eliminate all these things. But that's simply not possible in terms of our constitutional structure of separation of powers. It can't be done. It's not that they chose not to do it. It can't be done unless you control the presidency or have 67 seats in the Senate, which the Republicans don't have. So they've misled their base, and they're paying the price for that right now. Trump appeals to what I call the middle finger segment of the American electorate, the people who are thoroughly fed up with politics and politicians as usual. And so we'll hear conservative Republican politicians talk about their policies in politics. We'll hear liberal Democrats and their politicians talk about liberal politics and policy. Trump cuts across both those because he's attractive to people who don't like politics and politicians in general.
Do those people go to the polls? Do those people caucus?
Question. Right, that's the big question. It's an excellent question. There's been some concern that among Trump people, they go to the rallies for the celebrity and the excitement, but they don't really caucus. We don't know. I mean, typically, except for 2008, we get roughly at best 120, 125,000 members of either party caucusing. And I think on the Democratic side, if we have a significant bump over that, that's probably, at least at this point, going to be Sanders support. If we get a big bump on the Republican side, that could be Trump support, in which case Republicans will be very worried. Or it could be Cruz's strategy of trying to get more conservative evangelicals to participate than have in the past. That's his whole tactic.
All right, Dennis, we'll take a break, and our conversation continues coming up. Welcome back to KCCI 8 News Close-Up. Joining me is KCCI political analyst Dennis Goldford. Dennis, George Pataki dropped out of the race. Lindsey Graham dropped out of the race before Christmas. Anybody else you expect to leave the race before the caucuses?
Well, it didn't exactly reshuffle the field when Graham and Pataki dropped out because they were polling in asterisks, basically. I think, you know, in terms of the people who are way down there, Rick Santorum, I think, will hang in because he keeps pointing to what happened 4 years ago. He was in the low to mid single digits, and lo and behold, he ended up in a virtual tie on caucus night. So he'll see it through. We've not heard a lot about Carly Fiorina lately, but I think she could at least stick it through Iowa and then New Hampshire. So, again, something unexpected could come up, but at this point, it's hard to see any obvious reason for anybody remaining at the moment of the major ones we talk about to drop out.
And Ben Carson, for a long time, was at the top of the polls here in Iowa, but there's not a whole lot of conversation about him these days.
That's right. It's very interesting. His limitations have come to the fore. That's one of the things you happen to see during a campaign for any party and any candidate. He's been running a lot of advertising here in Iowa lately. In fact, he and Cruz and Rubio seem to be running the most, either their own campaigns or the super PACs associated with them. There's a core of support for Carson, and it's people who likely would go to Cruz. So in a sense, for Carson to stay in, that could depress Cruz's total a little bit. If Carson were to get out, he doesn't seem like the kind of person to do that, at least through Iowa. That could help Cruz, in fact.
Okay. Now, you mentioned Santorum, Rick Santorum. Mike Huckabee also running again this time around, both caucus winners in previous years. So is there, aside from the two men that are familiar, is there something different about this year's crop of Republican candidates?
Well, everybody for a while thought that governors would have an advantage this time around. And of course, Chris Christie is still in the race. He keeps making the point that governors actually do things. They don't just sit and talk the way senators do in his way of thinking. And it's been surprising that governors haven't had more traction. Walker's out, a governor. Jindal's out, a governor. Pataki's out, a governor, but he didn't have much of a chance anyway. So I think it's generally among Republicans a sense of fear for the future of the country. And you've got a lot of people speaking in somewhat apocalyptic tones if they don't win. So that's a difference.
Now let's talk about and compare and contrast Iowa voters versus New Hampshire voters, if you would, and we're in our final moments of the program here.
Sure. Putting it briefly, Iowa Republicans are very much more religious conservative. New Hampshire Republicans are very much more fiscal conservative. So a Cruz could do well in Iowa and not well in New Hampshire. But the thing to remember is that independents can vote in New Hampshire. They can just walk in and ask for either party's ballot. In Iowa, you have to be a registered member of the party whose caucus you want to participate in. And so there's this great floating batch of people in New Hampshire who can sway the race even in the last several days.
Any backlash for a candidate who wins in Iowa to not receive great support in New Hampshire?
Well, we've had that before. Some early senator named Barack Obama had that happen in 2008. He managed to get past it.
All right, Dennis, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us. And thank you for joining us this morning on KCCI 8 News Close Up. If you missed any of the program, go to our website, kcci.com.